in English. And what really took the biscuit was when I discovered a secret audio affair that my girlfriend was having with Dan Savage and a podcast called Lovecast, I think. And it was, she tried to keep it secret. She really did it with a laptop under the blanket with headphones, and she was addicted to this podcast. So that was the point when I knew I had to deal with it. What was going on there? Millions of people in the, according to my prejudices, in the least country that I would expect radio in another form to have such an impact. In the USA, millions of people listening to radio on the internet, not on air. And this is coming and happening also in Europe. It has happened in many countries, and there are other forms also. Some of my authors that used to work and who you might know, like Lorenz Rollhäuser, for example, who won the Prix Europa a few years back, they are working now for international media groups like Detour, designing and storytelling audio logs that people can download from the internet. So there's a new market also out there, and there's also money in it. So Sarah Geis and Johanna Zorn, they are working for the Third Coast Festival, and it's called Third Coast in the USA because it's neither West Coast nor East Coast, but it's the coast of the Great Lakes. So they're in the middle of the country and they have the best perspective on what's happening there, the culture of podcasting and others and co. So I'm very, very glad that they took the long trip from the USA to come here to tell us a little bit, to give us an overview about what is happening there, and later after their presentation we have time for questioning everything. So please come on stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens, and thank you, everyone. We're really honored to be at the IFC with all of you amazing makers from all over the world. People who've come really, really far to take part in this, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. So, as Jens said, we are going to talk about the podcast scene in America. And we're going to focus on story-based podcasts, not the savage love type podcasts, but you should listen to that too, that Jens is talking about, but podcasts that are in the area of feature and documentary and story, because at Third Coast, that's what we do. We curate. We are always looking, always have our ears out for wonderful storytelling in all of its many different forms. And what we do then is sort of gather it all in, and then we share it with people in as many ways as we can at our website, thirdcoastfestival.org, as I just said, online, on our broadcast and podcast, which is called the Third Coast Podcast. And we love to gather people together. One of our favorite things to do is to go on the road and in Chicago have listener parties. So. We also it's also important to us to support the makers, because there's not going to be wonderful work for people here unless there are opportunities for makers. So we host a competition, which is actually on right now. You might want to consider entering your work. And we have a biennial, every other year conference, and the next one is in 2016. And I know a few of you, show of hands, have been to the conference before, so I guess you're familiar with Third Coast. So one of the things I think that got this whole interest in the podcast going here at IFC and why we were invited is because of this little podcast called Serial. Maybe I should start out by asking, how many people have heard Serial? Ooh. And how many people here would actually consider themselves podcast listeners? Regularly listen? Okay. Well. That's a lot of you. I am going to keep this sort of middle of the road, not for people who haven't heard, but people who are far progressed into the podcast world, and try to find some middle ground, but as you said, there's lots of room at the end for questions. So, as you know, Serial. This is a true story of a young man who's been in jail for 15 years for killing his ex-girlfriend when they were high school students. The question was he guilty? Did he deserve to be behind bars? And if he didn't, was there someone else who should have been behind bars instead? So these are the questions that captured the imaginations of millions in America and clearly across the globe. The word got out bit by bit about Serial, and person to person, internet site to internet site, it has been written about, it has been parodied, there's a podcast about the podcast. But I think let's start by hearing a little bit of it and refreshing our memories of this story.
This is a global friendly prepaid call from an inmate from Maryland Correctional Facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig. For the last year, I've spent every working day trying to figure out where a high school kid was for an hour after school one day in 1999. Or if you want to get technical about it, apparently I do, where a high school kid was for 21 minutes after school one day in 1999. This search sometimes feels undignified on my part. I've had to ask about teenagers' sex lives, where, how often, with whom, about notes they passed in class, about their drug habits, their relationships with their parents. And I'm not a detective or a private investigator. I'm not even a crime reporter. But yes, every day this year, I've tried to figure out the alibi of a 17-year-old boy.
So doesn't that music bring it back for you if you haven't heard it in a while? So I don't know if this was happening to you, but I would go places, I would be at my book club, I would be at the supermarket, I would run into people I know, and they would say to me, have you heard Serial? And it's never happened to me with the radio program before. And the next question they would ask me is, do you think Adnan, who's at the center of the story, the man behind bars, do you think Adnan is guilty? So it would go from there. And as I said, this has really never happened to me before, and there was clearly something extra special going on, and exactly what was it? But to backtrack just a little bit, so podcasts are an alternative means of distribution. They're really not, they're different in the sense that there are, there's sort of two sides to it. There's strengths and weaknesses to being a podcast. But it's still programs, they're still distributed, they're not on the radio, they're digital audio files. You download them to your computer, or more often your whatever pad you might have, or your phone, because you want to take them. Then you can just sort of take your shows with you wherever you go, whether you're jogging, or doing the dishes, or waiting in line somewhere, you have your programs with you. Once you download a podcast for free, it is there. Every time there's a new episode, it pops up for you. It's right there for you. So podcasting's actually been around for a decade. It debuted in about 2004, and listenership has grown bit by bit by bit. It's just been sort of this slow increase, and it's probably kind of matched also the acquisition of people having smartphones. Because as soon as you have a smartphone, of course, there's so much more that you can do with it. One of the things is downloading podcasts. It's a very simple app, especially if you have an iPhone, for doing it. But Serial just then, if the graph is going like this, then it just went straight up with Serial. So, I know that one of the questions that is coming, so why Serial? Why did this podcast gather so much attention? What was different about this? What made its meteor rise? Well, it was a project. I have a few theories, and you may also as well, so please feel free to share them in the Q&A. But it was a project of This American Life. I'm assuming most of you have heard of the program, hosted by Ira Glass. It's been on the air for over 15 years. It's a storytelling program. Each week is a different theme, broken down into acts, smaller stories. It has won every prize you can win. They're very journalistically sound. They care about getting the story just right. So that was a huge help. This American Life host and producer started talking about Serial way before it debuted, building up interest slowly but surely, talking to his 1 million+ audience. The very first episode of Serial aired on This American Life on the radio show. And Ira Glass went on the late night circuit of TV talk shows and started talking up the program. And then he did something kind of fun. Because there's still a lot of people who, when they think about podcasts, they think, well, that's a little fussy. I would really just rather turn on my radio. Podcasting is a couple of other little extra steps. So he wanted to encourage people, invite people, welcome them to also listen to podcasts. So he made a video with his very good friend. Mary.
Okay, here we go.
I thought you were starting.
I'll start.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I'm Ira Glass.
I'm Mary, Irish friend.
And I'm here because we're starting a new podcast. It is the first spin-off show from our program. We're very excited. It's called Serial. And we've come to learn that many of you do not know how to get a podcast. And we thought, we have to show you how to get a podcast because it's not very hard.
And I thought I'd ask you to come here today.
Because I know how to do it.
Not only do you know how to do it, but you do it every week, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Every week. Every week for your show.
I don't need to give away your age, but is it safe to say you are an actual older person?
I'm on the dark side of 85, how's that?
Okay, so Mary, so why don't you explain to us how to do it, how to get a podcast?
Oh, first thing you do is go to the website. That you know.
That's right. Most of you, I would have to say, you surely can get yourself to a website. Let's give the web address right now.
When you get there, this is what you will see on the screen. And there's a little arrow over there. You press it, and congratulations, you're listening to a podcast.
Couldn't be easier. And it also works on your phone. This is the Serial website. See this little arrow, you push the arrow, you listen to a podcast. Now, if you want to download a podcast to your tablet or to your phone, what you do is that you can basically just get an app that'll do all the work for you. It's super simple. If you have an iPhone, there's an app called Podcasts. Couldn't be easier. The name of the app is Podcasts. Get on that app, and then you subscribe to Serial or any podcast you want. And basically what it does is that it delivers every new podcast right there on your phone. You don't have to do anything after that. You do it once, you're all set. If you have an Android device, you can try one called Stitcher. That's a good one to start with. And basically, again, you look for the name of the podcast you like. Serial Podcast will be our new show. This American Life is our old show. And then it does all the work for you.
Try it, it's wonderful. It's a whole new world. I love it. Yeah, I do. I truly do. It's opened up so much for me.
What are we going to do today? We're going to come into the office and shoot this thing.
Nothing much.
Right?
Crosswords, times up in, pick up the dogs here.
That was so much fun. That's what Ira can do. So, other reasons why the program was so popular, in our opinions. It was a good story. And not only was it an intriguing murder mystery, there was a lot at stake. There was a young man behind bars, and maybe he didn't belong behind bars. So we were, engaged with a really important and real story. We got to know the central character, Adnan, from prison, and he got an opportunity to, get to know him and perhaps even empathize. Not necessarily believe he was innocent, but empathize with his position. The story unfolded a bit by bit each week. And obviously this is not a new idea. This has been going on from the beginning of time. And novels were serialized, and radio was serialized, and TV is serialized. But it really hadn't been done this way in radio about a true story in a really, really long time. The writing and the musical scoring were exceptional, and using some of the tropes of TV, it started with last week on Serial, and it always ended with leaving you like on some cliff, wondering what was going to happen next, and waiting for the next Thursday when Serial would drop. It would drop at about 8 a.m. in Chicago on Thursday mornings, and we'd all get into the office and say, well, have you heard it yet? And that was happening everywhere. We also learned that Sarah Koenig might not have all the answers. I think when the show first started, we thought, it's a 12-part series. We'll find out whether Adnan was guilty or not. Can't wait to find out. But then it became obvious that maybe that wasn't the story. That she was still producing between weeks. Yeah, she'd gotten a few in the can, but now she was doing it as the show was going on, as the weeks were going by. And it also became clear that she might actually not have an answer or the answer. And so people became engaged by starting to play off of her research, do more research, get into chat rooms, and go on the site Reddit and write down their theories and do research. So it engaged people in this incredible way. Which of course got more people listening to Serial. And I would say that Sarah, for me, and I hope for some of you, that Sarah Koenig herself was a compelling person to tell the story. I thought she had the authority to tell the story, but also would leave herself open to doubt. But she wasn't cocky about it. But she had control of the narrative. She was friendly, and then we started to care about her, telling her story. And I don't know if I just said that you might know that there was a podcast that reviewed the podcast, just the same way, I don't know if you're familiar with the Slate series of podcasts, so big popular TV shows like Mad Men have podcasts about them that kind of review and take apart each show, and there was also a Slate podcast that reviewed the podcast, so those are some of our reasons why, and there are probably more why Serial was so incredibly popular. But why was it a podcast? Would the same have happened on radio? Well, I think there's some reasons why it being a podcast, that delivery system was really, really good for Serial. First of all, it was available to everyone at the same time. It was a really communal experience, no matter where you were in the world. We were all getting the episodes at the same time, which was really kind of an amazing experience. In radio, it might be like Poughkeepsie, playing at one time, and Central Toledo, Ohio at another time, because stations make their own schedules. European stations would make their own schedules, but yet it was this really communal experience. It was just direct to listeners in some ways, and I'm interested in how you feel about this. They actually took the radio station out of the equation, which will be interesting to see if that happens more and more. Why convince a radio station to air Serial, which they might have, because This American Life has a great track record, and then that station tries to bring an audience? Why not just go straight to the audience? So, something to think about. If you missed an episode, you could go back and you could listen to the others. You knew exactly where they were. They were in your podcast feed. And a lot of people found out about the show somewhere into into the series, and then they could binge listen, like listen to a whole chunk of them at a time. And again, binge listening and radio, I don't think has gone together very often, and it did there. The episodes could vary in length, so if it was the material fit 20 minutes, or some weeks it fit 60 minutes, it didn't have to fit into a time slot, and that was a huge advantage. It was portable, as I've talked about. And here's something that was really important too. So this was a huge devotion of resources and time. I think Sarah Koenig had a year to work on this project. And actually had a producer working with her as well. So to be able to do this, you need money. How are they able to raise money? Through advertising, which we also call sponsorship because it doesn't sound so icky. And they were able to sell ads. And because the rules for public radio, you can't have ads, you can have underwriting, which is lots of, you can't have a call to action, you can't say buy this. But if it's an ad on podcast, you can say buy this, and they did. So yes, This American Life was able to do such a thing, but it is not only for the people of This American Life, but those kinds of resources, many others are getting into podcasting, and that's where Sarah's going to pick up.
So it used to be, if you had a creative idea for a new program, you would need to go to your local public radio station, and you would basically need to knock on the door and hope that someone sympathetic opens it a little bit. And that would happen sometimes. Maybe you'd get in, maybe you'd talk to an editor, maybe you'd get an internship, but more often than not, the door was very closed. And that's not what's happening right now. We're seeing that most new producers are going about getting their work to listeners in a totally different way. And there's two main factors that we see that's making this happen in the US. The first is very basic, new technology. We have little recorders, you can keep it in your purse. There's editing systems on laptops. Getting a podcast out through a website is very easy, and so for the first time, you don't need the resources of a studio at a radio station in order to make work. So there's this whole new generation of potential radio makers with ideas who are able to make the work on their own. The second is more specific to the US, and it'll be interesting to hear how it does and doesn't relate to all the various places where we're from in this room. But it's that there's some very serious limitations in our public broadcasting system, especially right now. So some of you might know that in the US, a very tiny bit of funding for public radio comes from the government. It's actually about 6%. The rest of the funding comes directly from listener support. So listeners send in their checks, large and small, lots of small, and there's foundation support as well. And because of this, understandably, lots of decision makers at public radio stations are very, very hesitant to take a risk. They want to satisfy their existing listeners, who are, in the majority, over 55 years old and white, so that they can continue to make work, so that their donor base stays listening, so that no one gets upset. There's a sort of extreme example of this, is that there is a show on public radio in the US. It's called Car Talk. It's about cars. And it ran for about 20 years. And when the host retired, public radio stations continued to play the same show in their prime slots, just reruns. And when this past year, one of the hosts died, public radio stations have continued to play the same shows in the same spots as reruns. Which is just to say that with only one public radio station in most cities and with its programming devoted to a combination of news and just a couple of old favorites, tried and true programs, there just really isn't much space on our radio for programs which don't fit the mold. There is an upside of this, which is by default, it's encouraging a new entrepreneurial spirit. If you want to make documentary work, you need to think outside the box. And podcasting has become this very fertile ground for radio programs whose format or whose voice is not, might be deemed risky by public radio stations. So what I'm going to do next is play just a couple examples from some interesting producers and programs that we see finding success via podcast versus broadcast radio. And then we'll talk a little bit about why that might be so. So the first category of feature makers who are moving to podcasting are really public radio veterans, producers who have been working within the system for a long time and are now taking this jump. And I'm guessing that many of you in here have already heard the work of Scott Carrier. He's an American producer. He has a very distinctive voice, a distinctive writing style. No one else sounds like him. And in the early 1980s, Scott actually literally hitchhiked to Washington, D.C., went to the headquarters of National Public Radio, and literally knocked on the door. And they let him in. And he made his first radio story then, and since then, has been making the occasional documentary here and there. He's been getting it on public radio once every couple of years, big programs like This American Life. But he wasn't able to make a living of it. And he, for many years, the past 15, stepped away from the radio world altogether. Until earlier this year, where he came back with a podcast. His podcast is called Home of the Brave. And on it, he releases some of his earlier work, as well as brand new stories that he's making right now. So to give you a sense of how this sounds, I'm going to play the opening of one of his very classic pieces. It's called Running After Antelope. And you're going to hear in this version the new introduction he's added for the podcast form.
Welcome to Home of the Brave. I'm Scott Carrier. So I was sitting in Art Silverman's office at NPR in 1984, and in walks the science editor for All Things Considered. Art says, "Hey, Scott, you have an idea for a science story? Tell her your idea." So I say, "My brother is working on his master's degree in biology, and he has a theory that human beings evolved as endurance predators, able to hunt big game without weapons by running them down in the heat of the day. We're going to Wyoming this summer to test this theory by trying to run down some pronghorn antelope." As I was delivering this brief pitch, I watched the science editor go cross-eyed, and then she stopped breathing, And when I was done, she walked out of Art's office without saying a word. It just didn't go well. Luckily, I didn't need her approval to do the story. I already had a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. Yes, arts money to make a science story. Those really were the good old days. The story eventually aired on All Things Considered, introduced by Noah Adams.
In the world of science, there's supposed to be a reason for everything. A reason why the sky is blue, a reason why dogs chase bicycles. There's even somewhere a reason why socks disappear in the washing machine. However, there is no generally accepted reason why you and I stand on our own 2 feet instead of loping around on all fours the way most animals do. Over the years, anthropologists have come up with all kinds of different explanations, but it's hard to think of experiments that might prove anything. A friend of ours named Scott Carrier decided, however, to do some research on his own. He sends this report.
And there they go. What? There they go. See? Crossing over there? No. Over to the right. Quite a ways away, in fact. Way up there.
A couple of years ago, my brother and I went to Wyoming to run down an antelope.
I see 3 over there.
Well, there were about 8 down there.
Yeah. Yes.
It was August, and our plan was to chase one animal until it overheated and collapsed. It just took off running. You want to follow? We had good reasons for what we were doing. One was that it seemed entirely possible. Another had to do with an argument concerning human evolution. It's a scientific argument, so it takes a few minutes to explain.
So that is classic, very strange Scott Carrier. And what you can hear there is that when he's releasing this via podcast, he's adding an introduction. He's speaking directly to listeners. He's providing a little bit of context, in this case, some of the limitations about the radio station that I discussed earlier, and then going straight into his older piece. But Scott is also releasing new work, and he's experimenting with new kinds of reporting on his podcast. And actually, right now, or earlier this month, he's been in Nepal with his daughter, and they've been reporting on the aftermath of the earthquake there, and releasing those dispatches directly from their laptop in Nepal straight to listeners. So through his podcast, Scott has reclaimed all of these old listeners who loved and missed his voice and were craving new work from him, but he's also found a completely new group of young radio fans, young radio producers who've never heard him before, and are talking about him and passing this along to their friends and to their parents. We recently interviewed Scott over at Third Coast, and he was very hopeful. He was even giddy about the possibility to make a go of it as radio, as a career for him now, which was great for us to hear. But there's another category of documentary makers who are finding some success in podcasting, and these are producers whose demographics, their age, their race, their backgrounds, are not traditionally represented in US public media at all. There's this podcast called Radio Ambulante that started a few years ago. It's based out of San Francisco, and Radio Ambulante's goal is to create stories by and for Spanish speakers in America. And right now in the US, there's about 50 million people whose primary language is Spanish, and there's no documentary radio program out there for them. So I'm going to play an excerpt from one of their recent stories. It takes place in Cuba. It's called Los Sobrevivientes, or The Survivors. And the part we're going to hear is straight from the middle of the piece. So what you'll need to know is that the story chronicles a group of Cuban punk rockers. In Spanish, punk rockers are called Los Frikis. And they find themselves in the 80s rejected and alienated by the communist government, and many times their family. And they take some very extreme measures to find a haven, as you'll get a sense of.
Y a finales de los 80 llegó otra amenaza.
Empezaba el comentario, no, fulano se enfermó, fulano se fue para el sanatorio, y ya iban cayendo de a poco.
Ni Gerson ni los de su generación sabían de qué se trataba. En 1989 llegaron los rumores. El gobierno de Pinar del Río estaba construyendo un nuevo hospital. Pero no iba a ser un hospital normal, sino un sanatorio, para internar a todos los que sufrían de esta nueva enfermedad.
Bueno, yo me enteré de la palabra SIDA en el 90.
En menos de 10 años, el VIH-Sida se había convertido en una epidemia en Cuba. La idea del sanatorio de Pinar del Río y varios más a lo largo de la isla era contener la epidemia. Y aunque suene raro, los frikis escuchaban las historias de cómo era la vida dentro del sanatorio y se imaginaban un paraíso.
Los enfermos le dicen lo que hacen con ellos en el sanatorio, las comidas, la buena vida.
En el sanatorio se comía 3 veces al día con un menú que incluía carne y helados. Algunas habitaciones tenían aire acondicionado.
La gente prefería, antes de estar viviendo en la calle, estar enfermo y venir para acá, pero tenerlo todo. Y de gratis, que era lo que más influía, que era gratis, regalado.
Era un estilo de vida que no se veía en el resto del país.
No había nada, y no había comida, no había jabón, no había nada. Ni aceite, ni cigarros, nada, absolutamente, ni transporte.
Cuando destruyeron el socialismo, quedó una esperanza para la humanidad.
Era el fin de la Guerra Fría y la isla pasaba por uno de los momentos más difíciles de su historia. El bloque socialista se desmoronaba y en un par de años la Unión Soviética dejaría de existir. Pronto comenzaría el periodo especial en Cuba, una época de profunda escasez. Pero en los sanatorios eso no se sentía. La cuestión era cómo entrar.
Eran rockeros, los rockeros no les gustaba trabajar, los rockeros les gustaba que las cosas les cayeran fácil. Y como más fácil ellos lo vieron fue inyectándose de SIDA.
Sí, lo que dice Johanna es cierto. Un friki enfermo le daba sangre a otro, y luego ese le daba sangre a otro más. Es imposible calcular cuántos se inyectaron. Las estadísticas oficiales de casos de autoinfectados son casi inexistentes, pero algunos calculan que fueron más de 200 en toda la isla. Pero había tanto que no sabían acerca del virus. Aún no se hablaba públicamente de la epidemia ni de la forma en que se contagiaba. Los frikis que se inyectaban eran casi todos hombres y no sabían que podían infectar a otra gente a través del contacto sexual. Y las novias de los frikis fueron las primeras en sufrir las consecuencias.
It's a really surprising, extraordinary piece of history that I'd certainly never heard before. And when I spoke with the producer, Luis Treyes, it's not common knowledge in Cuba or in the Latin American community as well. I encourage you to hear the rest of it. It's in some ways hopeful. They form these punk bands in the sanatorium, and there's a lot of joy there. And then, also a lot of heartbreak and sadness. One interesting effect of Radio Ambulante is that public broadcasters have been listening to it and translating some of the pieces into English and onto the American airwaves. So the program Radio Lab actually did a version of this piece that you can listen to in English. And radio makers are moving to podcasting, but in this way, podcasts are moving onto the airwaves as well. Now, the original goal of Radio Ambulante was to tell stories to Spanish speakers living in the US, but what they found is that it's actually gathering an audience throughout the global Spanish-speaking world. And that's one thing podcasting can do that's more difficult with radio, is really cross those borders so fluidly. So the one more, for now, reason why some documentaries are finding a better home on podcasts versus the radio waves is their content. Some of you here, I'm guessing, have heard episodes of Love and Radio, the podcast from the US. There was, I think, an episode was played at the IFC a few years ago. So Love and Radio is a show that chronicles life on the seedier side of things. There are con artists, strip club owners, stories, audio portraits of the down and out. It's very heavily, beautifully sound designed with original compositions. And the content is not for everyone. And it's not meant to be for everyone. And that's something that podcasts can really do. In that vein, there is a new show that's gaining prominence lately. It's a podcast, and it's called The Heart. Before it was called The Heart, it was called Audio Smut, so you can probably guess that the content's a little too racy for the American airwaves. But in addition to that, the voices that we're hearing on this podcast, the producers, they're young, they're gay and bisexual women, they're talking about sex. These are voices that are wildly outside your typical public radio voice. So here's an excerpt from their episode called Movies in Your Head. They call it a documentary experiment. It's a little bit of documentary, a little bit of radio drama. And you are going to hear producer Caitlin Prest on a New York City subway, looking for love or something like it.
Saturday. It's late. I only have 2 songs on my phone, and I'm listening to them over and over again. I'm moseying down the platform. The tiny straps in my summer dress are slipping down my shoulders. The air feels good. I'm playing my favorite subway waiting game. My eyes fall on each person waiting here, scanning to see if my heart jumps, to see if there's somebody who will meet my gaze, somebody I can stand aside and contemplate talking to. There's a girl with amber hair and a pink lacy dress. She's reading, doesn't look up. Clean-cut drunk guy. Is he looking at me? Is he? Alright, I will go. Mixed race andro girl with toque, ripped t-shirt. Nothing. Dark curly hair, beard, tight jeans, scrappy t-shirt. He looks. 1, 2, 3. He looks away. No prospects. My phone is dead. 45 minutes of fucking boredom. Mixed race andro girl looks up. I think she heard me say fuck. She meets my eyes. 2, 3, 4, 5. I look away now. She's a few feet away, sitting on a bench. I stare straight ahead. I can tell my cheeks got flushed. She's so pretty. What if I just went over there and sat right beside? That's so obvious. What if I sat down in the seat, not right beside, but the one beside the... I can't sit in the one beside the one, because it's just as fucking obvious. I wonder what it would be like to kiss her. Tastes like strawberries. Hey. Hey, you.
So that is me interrupting an excerpt from The Heart by producer Caitlin Prest. But you know, the edgy subject matter and even the ability to make your work without a radio station in the middle aren't the only reasons a producer might choose podcasting over broadcast radio. There's some important structural reasons too. Like Johanna mentioned earlier, podcasts can be any length. You don't have to fill an hour slot or a 27-minute slot. The stories can be as long or as short as you feel they need to be. And then frequency. Podcasts don't necessarily need to come out every week. They don't necessarily need to come out on a regular schedule. And so that gives radio makers some flexibility as well. And maybe this is more debatable, there's sound design. Right now on the US airwaves, there's not a lot of room for really experimental, really sound-rich sound and design. And there's a few exceptions, like Radiolab, and podcasting is the place where you really go to find that right now. So, business side of things. So, a lot of people are intrigued with this idea. Just as many people who are asking me, have you heard Serial, are saying, hey, I'm thinking of making a podcast. Well, before they do, they should consider a few things. I mean, it is just like a one-man or one-woman show. So you don't have this, I guess it's just like being an independent producer in some ways. You don't have the support of a radio station.
You're the producer, you're the executive producer, you're your editor, you're the distributor, you're the marketer in charge of finding listeners primarily through social networking. You're the fundraisers seeking sponsors. So it's good in a way that anyone who wants to make a podcast can. No one can shut the doors on you. You can do it if you want to. The better programs we found typically rise to the top. The not so good ones fade away. But it's also really daunting, as I said. How are you going to do all of these things? Can you be a marketer and an artist and a distributor? Can you be all of those things? And some people are doing it. But I think, as Jan said, people are moving there, people are listening, money is starting to follow. So the model that's being developed, and this has taken some while to actually happen, is this idea of a podcasting network. In a podcast network, your 20,000 listeners plus somebody else's 20,000 become 40,000, or I should say downloads. And then you have some power, perhaps. You can say on your show, hey, if you like my podcast, you can listen to that podcast. And I don't know, it's beginning to sound like a radio station a little bit, isn't it? So that's exactly what's happening. Perhaps you've heard of Radiotopia. They have 11 podcasts in their network right now, mostly story-based, not exclusively, including 99% Invisible, The Theory of Everything, and Love and Radio. Just this week, I had to change my script a little bit because they just received a $1 million grant. That's 3 million zloty. So that was a nice shot in the arm. So that was to help them bring new podcasts into the network and to support the people who were already there. Then they also have did a big, do you know what a Kickstarter campaign is? Like a, crowdsourced funding campaign where you basically ask everyone and anyone to give you some money, 500, 550, 500, 5,000, whatever you have. They raised $650,000 this way. So that was also very successful. The way they make money week in and week out is through ads, like we talked about with Serial. So they're trying to take a new approach to ads. The one thing they're doing is trying to weave it into the story so it's not so easy to skip over. So here's an example from Jonathan Mitchell's podcast, The Truth. He's a documentarian who's moved into radio drama, so his shows have a documentary feel even though they're drama. And they're very, very good. So here's the shaving ad.
One of our sponsors today is Harrys.com. They sell razors. And if you've been listening to the show, you know that I have a beard, so I don't really use a razor. So I thought I would send this razor to somebody as a gift. I was going to send it to my brother-in-law, Kevin. And it's a really great razor. He's going to love this. Let me get it out for you. I'll describe it. Where is it? Where did I put the razor? Jack? Hold on just a second. Hey Jack?
Yeah.
Have you seen the Harry's razor?
Oh, sorry.
Wait, are you using it right now?
Yeah, that's okay.
To shave your legs? You're using the Harry? I was going to give it to Kevin.
Mine now.
Harry's starter set is only $15. It includes a razor, foaming shave gel or shave cream, and 3 razor blades, plus free shipping. Go to Harrys.com now, and Harry's will give you $5 off if you type in our coupon code TRUTH. That's Harrys.com and enter the coupon code TRUTH at checkout for $5 off the starter set. You realize you're naked on the radio right now. Harrys.com. Start shaving better today.
Okay. How many people enjoyed that? Oh, good. How many people thought, oh no, that's not where radio's going? Yes, exactly. Well, there's this wonderful thing on your phone. It's called the 15-second forward. So once you've heard that ad once, and of course every week it changes a little bit, you can skip right over. I do that a lot. So Jonathan Mitchell, probably if I'd asked him a few years ago, and I told him he was going to be doing an ad for Harrys.com, would have just shrugged and said, no way. But now he says, thank goodness for Radiotopia. It was the light at the end of the tunnel for me. It's enabled him to actually make a career doing podcasts. So it's a trade-off. Here's another radio network. It's called Gimlet. It's for profit. But it was started by Alex Bloomberg of This American Life. So it just sounds like a public radio network too. They have 3 podcasts right now, and they're growing. How did they get started? They went around to like billionaire investors and said, invest in my podcast on the next best thing. And they raised $1.5 million. And now again, they're relying on ads. So we'll see how that goes. But the podcast network is the working model these days. People's like, it's the idea that you sort of start on your own and then you hope to join a network. There are lots of networks popping up. Public radio stations have networks. WBEZ, our home station in Chicago, has one. WNYC has a big one. NPR has one. And the other network, American Public Media, they have one. So we're just going to start seeing more and more of that. And perhaps across the pond as well. But still, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that lots of people are thinking they want to start podcasts. A lot of people are still doing it on their own. This is a creative outlet. They're not making any money. They're doing this in their spare time, truly, because they're passionate about the audio medium, and more people are.
So, the question is, where do we go from here? We recently got off the phone with a program director at a big station in the US. She's a big decision maker, and she called herself platform agnostic, meaning she didn't care how the stories got to the ears, she just cared that the stories were getting to listeners. And that's an attitude that we are slowly seeing more and more in the US. We don't know. The business models that Johanna just outlined are so new, we really don't know if they'll be sustainable. But while we're in this limbo zone, I think there's some interesting silver linings, some interesting things that might happen. One thing we hope is that the competition from these new networks will encourage public radio broadcast stations to take a few more risks, to create a little bit more of a playground for documentary work, to showcase some new voices. And so we'll see. What is very clear is that it's a brand new climate for listeners. The experience of being a radio fan and listener is new, and it's exciting. There are, in Chicago, I think twice a week we could go to either a listening event or a live taping of a podcast or a radio show or some other radio-related performance. In New York City, you could probably go every day. And we're also seeing a real culture of criticism forming around the work. I think it's because listeners choose what they want to listen to, because you need to be a little bit informed. You need to know what your options are, versus just turning on the radio and hearing what comes out of it. That listeners are starting to read about radio. They're starting to write about radio. There are great academic journals popping up, like Radio Doc Review. There's also a more recent sort of pop culture podcast review site called The Timbre in the US, and we're seeing articles written about radio documentary in the US in all the papers, which we've never seen before. And so that's exciting to us, that this art form that we love so much, in whatever form it's taking right now, is really getting the respect and this discourse, like film, like painting, like all the others. So we want to leave lots of room for Q&A, but before we do, we just have a little audio tidbit that delights us, maybe the last word for now on podcasting, and this is from comedian Nick Offerman.
Out of the billions of thermal tubes inside your computer, through some necessary wires and pipes, into your kitchens and living rooms and cars and office spaces and halfway houses. A veriform bouquet of content delivered with precision and love to you. It's magic. That's the only way to look at it. Magic, except it's not magic at all. A podcast is every bit as explainable as your toaster. As explainable as the crushing nettles you feel in your chest whenever you think of your father. Never before has so little meant so much to so many. Podcast. Say it with me. Podcast. Please, I don't want to be the only one saying it. Can't you feel your lungs starting to burn with the truth of it? And yet there's still so much we can't know. We're just doing figure eights across the surface of it. How about some history? The podcast was invented as a way for people with computers to tell people with computers things through their computers. Some of these things are, hey, I'm over here, and I have certain feelings, and maybe if we thought about it this way. Through time, improvements have been made on the podcast until it feels ordinary and natural. But it's not natural. It's a frozen lake, iced over with enchantment. And like a frozen lake, this podcast is only here for a short time. And when it's gone, it's just back to being a lake with birds and reeds and sheep. Where's the enchantment? Uh-oh, it's in you now. All you can do is spread it around.
Thank you very much. So please stay there for some Q&A. When the podcast apparatus began, I asked myself, is it a vogue? When you say now serial, what it does is leaving the radio stations out of the equation, then I get the feeling it might be a revolution, because if a multi-million-dollar market also leaves behind the radio stations, that is something to think about. You already gave us some examples of how the broadcasters, the traditional broadcasters, and we have to keep in mind that in the US the public broadcasting is very, very different to the European one, reacts to this vogue or revolution. You said that Radiolab was picking up on topics that were presented in podcasts first. You also said that they created their own podcasts. Like Sylvain Gier here was ahead of his time for like a decade, creating Arte Radio. Do you have other examples of how the traditional industry is reacting to that?
Yeah, well, one thing is that, and we didn't really talk about this, is that radio shows are just podcasted. So you have all the shows that you like just available through podcast. So that's one major way that they're reacting. Another way that the traditional public broadcasting is reacting, as we said, is by having their own networks, like jumping in the sandbox and playing in this game too. But there's definitely, I'm pretty sure This American Life has aired podcasts. Maybe worked them a little bit, reworked them a little bit. Resound, because that's what we do, is we're just finding the best work we can everywhere and anywhere. We put podcasts, we feature them on our radio show and podcast. So yeah, the fluidity is definitely there, and everyone is just kind of jumping in and finding their place and finding out if it's lucrative. That's still a question.
Yes. Are there other questions in the audience? Sylvain.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the differences in writing for podcast or writing for traditional radio. For example, there's a woman on the subway thing. I think I don't see that as a regular radio show. I think it's really written for podcast because it's very intimate and it's as if she was speaking to one person at a time. Do you agree with that? And what would you think would be new ways of writing for podcast especially?
That's interesting to hear you say that. I think we're seeing that the producers of podcasts are developing a slightly different relationship with their listeners. And I think, as you say, it's often more intimate. Sometimes that's just talking directly to their listeners at the beginning or at the end of the piece. Sometimes it is the writing. Caitlin Press, the producer of that piece, I think has a pretty clear idea of who her audience is. So she's not writing to the most general audience to please the most people, but she is writing to a specific audience who have not been subjected to her work, except in this room, but are actually choosing to listen to her work. And so I think that because of that, podcast makers are showing more of their personality for better and for worse. Sometimes they're sharing personal details of their lives. They're really developing a community with their listeners, and that carries over into live events. So I think the writing is just all one part of that big change.
And another question that is linked to that, there is something that is very interesting now, is binaural recording and binaural listening, because more and more our listeners are actually people who are alone and they are listening to our stuff through headphones and earphones. So recording things in binaural gives you a sensation of audio 3D. What is it a big thing in America too? Are you guys working with this? Are you familiar with it or?
I think just a little bit. I think that that's something that we'll hopefully see more of, but I definitely, people listening on their headphones, which right there gives you a more intimate experience with the work and also makes it a much more wonderful place to be hearing really sound-rich work. So I hope so.
Just to add to that, I do think Detour, which Jens mentioned, which is an audio tour company. It's there's Battery Radio in Newfoundland. It's not the first, but they are doing some experiments with binaural recording. But we still haven't seen very experimental radio take off in any mainstream way over podcast.
It's me. I would like, Leslie, I would like to find out a bit more about this idea of a network and how the network works, especially the business model of the networks. And I also think, it's no wonder that the podcast starts with a series. So I think this idea of having like one big headline and then you can put anything in you want, it's also like a marketing tool. So how about single pieces? How do you promote them on podcast?
In terms of the single pieces, what is happening there is that you will have independents who are contributing to another podcast. So again, it's just like the radio model. You're doing one-off pieces for another podcast, as you might do a one-off piece for a program. But if you're an individual maker that does a few pieces a year, perhaps, or half a dozen, your own podcast is not going to be the way to go. In terms of networks, it really is, it's new and it's experimental and who knows, but like Radiotopia, you have to be invited. How do you get invited? Nobody knows. There's not an application form. Is it just the artistic leanings of one or two people? Yeah, probably. Gimlet, it is coming from, the sensibility of Alex Bloomberg and the people he's hired, and they're creating a new podcast where Radiotopia is sort of bringing in ones that are sort of fledgling, growing up, and they see opportunity and they bring them in. And then radio stations, it's kind of fun at BEZ where they have their standard ones, the ones that they promote a lot. And then they have like the minor leagues in baseball or something, like the Sandbox, and they'll give someone 6 months and say, hey, we'll give you 6 months, try your podcast, let's see how it goes. And it isn't a long-term relationship. And if it doesn't work out, then you move on and nobody's feelings are hurt. I expect we're going to see a lot of other variations on this theme, but right now, Radiotopia is huge in America. Well, the money comes from grants, because they're nonprofit. They come from asking people for money, just the way public radio does in America. If you've heard an American fundraiser. Has anyone heard an American fundraiser? Okay, not many people. So if you're listening right now, you probably love this radio station. It's this radio station you have fixed into your radio dial. And if that's you, we really appreciate it. If you give $5 or $100, whatever you have, or become a recurring member to this radio station. On and on, for 10 minutes, an hour, for a week. And you know what? It works. People send in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. BEZ has like a $23 million budget. They get half of that, over $10 million in individual gifts. So that's also happening for podcast networks. They use something more often called like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, system set up so you can get small gifts or large gifts, and you get little prizes you can do, little t-shirts and things like that. And the other way is selling ads. But you know, that's my job at Third Coast. I raise foundation money and I'm in, you know, run the organization, the administration, etc.
Yeah.
And then I have to find ads. You know how hard that is? It's like a whole writing grants and tucking companies into giving Third Coast money. Those are two different people that I'm trying to like be both of, and I'm really discovering that it's like impossible. I'm going to hire somebody. I've just decided that.
I could tell that you had experience doing that when you showed us just now. Next question is by Liam, and then it's Ingo.
Hi, thanks Millie for the presentation. I have two questions, and they I'm coming at them from the point of content and craft. So the first one is about personality, in that a lot of American radio and increasingly a lot of European radio is, in terms of the field that we're in about telling stories, is trending towards a content style which must be led by a personality, and podcasts can feed into this exceptionally well. So, I mean, what would you have to say about that in terms of to me it's an anathema, you know, I don't want somebody getting in the way of the story, and yet I can see there's huge value, MTV culture, so on and so forth, it's celebrity building to an extent, you know, but what's your take on that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a trend we saw happening in the US for better and for worse before podcasting. I mean, even the Ira Glass video that you saw here, I mean, he has really become a personality. It's that every carefully crafted, everyday person just telling your friend a story. That's very popular in the US, and that's carried over to podcasting. Podcasting, you know, because of this intimacy that we discussed, sometimes can feel a little more extreme in that regard. I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think one reason, and it's likely changing, is, you know, as Johanna was saying, podcasters often working totally on their own. And because of that, they don't have the support of an editor and of a team who are dialing things down a bit. And I think the networks are creating structures in which there will be more support and there will be other ears. And in that way, you know, that might slightly change things, but it's absolutely a trend that we see in the US, sometimes to really great effect, and that we're not hearing as much in the work here.
Let's add one more thing to that. So there's a podcast called Strangers. Has anyone heard Strangers? Hosted by Leah Tao, and she's wonderful. She did a series about her own love life, and being over 40 and not being able to find someone important in her life. And it got really intimate. As many as it turned, like she got some really strong hate mail, but more than that, she got so many more followers and listeners. So, you know, I don't even know how I feel about that, to be honest. But it's effective, and it met some need for her. And she's moved on from there, and she's not telling her story anymore. But she always starts out her podcast with a little bit about her and where she's at. I would like to think that there's also a place for podcasts that don't have to go in that deep, and you know, you heard the truth. And other than that sort of ad where, you know, that we played, it's pretty straight. There's a topper, an ad, and he gets right into the show. And I don't think you get to know Jonathan Mitchell all that well. So, but I also wonder, would it be bad if there were more people whose names we recognized in the radio world? Like, would that be good? I think something, you know, having done this for the past 15 years, it was so hard to get anyone to pay any attention to what we were doing for the most part. Even like NPR. So when we have our winners, they'll cover the Pulitzers and they'll cover, various other awards. I still haven't cracked that nut. They'll, talk about they'll cover the winners of the Third Coast Festival. So I'd like to think that hopefully something positive will come out of this, and that the sort of the rising profile of radio and maybe, I don't want to call them celebrities, but known people is a good thing.
Okay, thank you. And the other one then is again about craft, and I think we've heard it this week, and I hear it a lot more increasing. I have this sense that there's a diminution of standard in the actual craft of radio making in terms of docs, and that we're getting further and further away from action scenes in real life, and like on a very simple level, one can write themselves out of any situation or into any situation, but to capture the situation is a unique skill, and I can see the value in podcasts and the trend of really well crafted word, but equally so without all the support that a station can bring. The skill isn't there to capture real life sounds as they're happening. So, for instance, the clips I heard today in a lot of serial, it's very much written, word driven, and so the form is changing. I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that's right about the clips we played today, but I'm not sure that I agree that that's happening more widely. In the podcast people are listening to, or really in American radio, I think there's still a lot of really great reporting going on. On public radio and being podcasted via public radio. Independent producers who are starting up their own podcast don't necessarily have the resources to do all of that reporting, but I'm curious what you think. I'm not sure that's a difference between distribution methods. I'm not sure that's a radio versus podcasting issue, but maybe a larger trend in American radio. But there's still really strong reporting being done all over public radio.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, all the people, we didn't want to just say, oh, here are our favorite podcasts that might have given you a slightly different impression. We wanted to show how podcasting is reaching out to new audiences. We thought that was really important because that really distinguishes it from what we're hearing on radio in America. But, the Love and Radio podcast is just beautifully and intensely produced and full of verite scenes and really amazing. And Radio Lab, which is also this just gorgeously produced show, they do separate podcast episodes that also are very scene heavy. So yeah, I think it's probably, I think there's more opportunity as, even as people don't have the resources. That's the kind of thing that's amazing and maybe the most startling, that there is this sort of entrepreneurial spirit. People are willing to do a lot for nothing.
Okay. Next is Ingo and then Lorelei Harris, so keep your answers a little bit more brief maybe.
So much to say.
And maybe the questions short also. Podcasting in the first place is a technical device, so what strikes me more than the success of podcast is the success of documentary formats. So how would you regard this? Was that sleeping for a long time and the new technology set something free, as to do with experimentation? And the thing we in classical radio stations struggle with, how do we address people who never even thought of, I'm gonna go and listen to a 30-minute piece with documentary material, so how does this change? And then a short question, please be honest, how many outstanding documentary podcasts are there and how many middle class, not so good, amateur podcasts are there?
First question, remind me of the first question again. I'm just kind of cut. Is there more? Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that's exciting, Serial's been sort of like a gateway drug. People who never listened to radio documentary before have discovered there's this whole world of it and a tradition of it going back. And so I really do think podcasting has opened up people's ears to listening to other documentaries. Second question. There's a lot of podcasts out there, but I'd say the podcasts that you would find in a network, they're really quite good. I mean, of course there's a lot of crappy podcasts out there, but we don't have to listen to them.
I hope that they'll come to conferences and they'll get better and better at their art. They're sort of like getting their foot in the door. As I said, a lot of them will just go away. Sadly, some of the good ones will go away too if they can't find the money.
So I'm not wishing it to be black and white. Are we supposed to be loving this or hating it? Because the way that you're describing it makes my hair grow on my teeth. It sounds like the new age of rabid individualism is upon us. And I'm not sure what the advantages of it are, whether it's a brave new world or whether it's just the sight of some kind of inferno opening up before us. Discuss
amongst yourselves. How much time do I have? Well, I'd like to think that that's where the curators come in. And there are more and more curators out there. It's something that Third Coast really loves. Every 2 weeks, we highlight a new program or a new documentary. And we're listening to a lot, and we're trying to pick out the best. I think it's like anything. There's a gazillion books out there, and a lot of them aren't very good. A lot of them are just sort of ego trips, right? Memoirs that are awful, etc., etc. So you need curators. We're doing that. The Timbre's doing that. There are other places you can find that are doing the dirty work of listening to all the not-so-great stuff so we can bring the best to you. And I think that's what happens in every art form, and I'm glad that it's come to this art form. And I'm actually happy to talk to any one of you, Lorelei included, individually, and find out what you'd be interested in hearing and recommending, whether it's whole podcasts or single episodes that I think show where it can be strong. And I also want to repeat, like, public radio in America is pretty dull. I mean, all things considered in the morning edition, good, strong news shows, occasionally do really interesting scene-based work, but people are starving for something else. And This American Life opened up an entire generation of ears to what a good story could be on the radio. And those people who listened to This American Life from there wanted to hear other work. And so Jad created Radio Lab, and then people come to us and say, I love This American Life, I love Radio Lab, but now I love that you're showing me work from England and Australia and Ireland and, and places far beyond. So, yes, there is work that you're going to love, and there's work that you're going to hate, and I hope that you look to us and find the good work.
That also answers a little bit Ingo's question, if it has been in the pipeline for a long time, because yes, I think those things that thrive are there. It's very interesting because 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago in Germany, everybody said that a private TV channel that you have to pay for, is, excluding if it's sports or some special interest, has no chance in the market. Absolutely no chance, because every German pays 1750 euros monthly for the public broadcast. So why pay a private one additionally to that? But now there's Netflix, and it thrives incredibly, and you pay 8 euros extra every month, and it works. So there are both sides of Armageddon and Paradise. Next question.
If goes about Armageddon, because all these internet revolutions, they give this impression from time to time that something will replace something that was before. It happened to music or books, for example. It was supposed a few years ago, so we were thinking that printed books will cease exist. And I got the impression that all these revolutions are not revolutions, they just add new ways of distribution and creating this, and nothing disappears, in fact. Only layers just they multiply. And if you think that the podcast will work exactly the same way, and if there are new things around the corner, no, maybe I don't.
I mean, I think that's a a really nice point, and I think it speaks a little bit to Lorelai's concern as well, that I think with everything going on right now, public broadcasting in the US is not going anywhere. The no advertisement model on public radio, I don't think is going anywhere. I think there's a chance here, and we have to wait and see, that having this new access to documentaries are really going to allow more features, more voices, the discourse to get better and more complex, and not just commercialized and individualized. So I think you're right, podcasting is here, but the hope is it will strengthen traditional public broadcasting. And I don't know what's next.
You never know. Well, thank you very much, Sarah and Johanna. This is really nice. Now we have a full quarter of an hour to drink coffee, and we will meet here again for the next listening session at past.
Well, then, how are you getting on? Getting slow?